إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. So 2 weeks ago, my apologies for missing last week, we covered the adab of the muta'allim, so the adab of the one who's learning. And of course we said that these adab, these etiquettes, they are more for the sacred sciences of Islam, but they apply to generally everything. So we had a quick run over of the etiquettes that we should apply as we learn. And now we've reached the adab of the muallim. So the muallim being the teacher. So the muta'allim being the learner, and the muallim being the teacher. So he says, Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, وظائف المعلم من اشتغل بالتعليم فقد تقلد أمرا عظيما وخطرا جسيما فليحفظ آدابه ووظائفه. So he starts out by saying something which is very important to understand, especially in our day and age today. We live in a day and age where everyone is presenting their own self as a source of information and a source of learning. But he says, من اشتغل بالتعليم فقد تقلد أمرا عظيما. Whoever basically engages in teaching, whoever takes upon him or herself the position of teaching, has taken on a great affair, has taken on something which is not to be taken lightly. وخطرا جسيما. And in fact, it is a dangerous situation to be in. When you're teaching, especially Islam, you're putting yourself in danger. How so? Because you are basically standing or sitting in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything that you say, every word that you put forward, every statement that you make, everything that you teach, you are going to be held accountable for. If you intentionally teach something which is wrong, then you are going to be held responsible for that by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you teach and you're not ready to teach, i.e. you do not have the proficient knowledge to be teaching, then you're going to be held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you're guessing, even if you're right, you're going to be held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the person who is truly conscious or truly fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not really put himself forward to teach unless they know what they're teaching. And it's very, very dangerous. And of course it applies to myself sitting here going through the book of Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah. Although I wouldn't really consider this to be teaching, it's more translating. But it's something to think about nowadays. Why? Because for many people, they study a book or two and they have a camera on their phone. So what do? They turn on their camera and they start to talk and they upload it, and perhaps they develop some popularity and they start to go with the role. And the reality is they're a charlatan. They are a faker. And this is not an area where you can fake it until you make it. If you're fake, then you're putting yourself in a position where you're going to be held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are countless examples that can be mentioned of fatwa, online fatwa being given by young people, young fools to be precise, that don't know what they're talking about, and it causes havoc within communities. If I do not speak the Arabic language, I have not memorized a good portion of the Quran, I do not understand the science of hadith, the science of fiqh, the science of theology, Islamic theology, then I should not be speaking about Islam. Even if it's a basic matter, I should always refer someone to someone who knows what they are speaking about. And someone might say, but what about the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? بَلِّغُوا عَنِّي وَلَوْ آيَةً. Relate that which you take from me, even if a verse. Firstly, we have to look at who was the Prophet talking to. The Sahaba, the companions, people who were learned, people who had the ability to understand. So that hadith relates to people that have taken the time to, and gone through the process of learning. If I am an ignorant person, I should not be speaking. And an ignorant person will not assume themselves to be ignorant. That's the problem with ignorance. You have two types of ignorance. You have ignorance which is known, and then you have ignorance which is compounded ignorance. The ignorance of a person who doesn't know that they are ignorant. And that's why we have to be very careful with ourselves. We should question ourselves 10 times before we speak. I will come to the questions at the end, inshallah. So he says, فَلْيَحْفَظْ آدَابُهُ وَوَظَائِفَهُ. So the teacher should take care to basically preserve the etiquettes of teaching, and the roles, the main purposes behind teaching. He says, الوظيفة الأولى الشفقة على المتعلمين. He says the first one is that he should have shafaqah, which is basically compassion for those whom he is teaching. And this is very important, especially in our time. And he says, بأن يقصد إنقاذهم من نار الآخرة. How is it that he's going to be compassionate? When we hear the word compassion, we assume softness, we assume being easygoing. But he says from compassion is to intend through teaching them to basically take them out from the possibility of falling into the hellfire. And that also tells us what the intention of the student should ultimately be: to protect ourselves, to protect oneself from being punished by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why we learn. We learn the rules of the road so that we don't put ourselves in danger or get fined and so on and so forth. Likewise, we learn the prohibitions and that which is permissible as set out for us by Allah, so that we can earn His reward, of course, but also protect ourselves from His punishment. And there are stations. There's the station of those who simply want to protect themselves from His punishment, a station of those who want His reward, and then there's a station of those who worship Allah because He is Allah, because they love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's a station that is reached after a long struggle. And he says, وَهُوَ أَهَمُّ مِنْ إِنْقَاذِ الْوَالِدَيْنِ وَلَدُهُمَا مِنْ نَارِ الدُّنْيَا وَلِذَلِكَ صَارَ حَقُّ الْمُعَلِّمِ أَعْظَمْ مِنْ حَقِّ الْوَالِدَيْنِ. And so we discussed this previously. He says that the attention that the teacher gives to protecting the student from the hellfire should be more emphasis should be placed on this than the emphasis that the parents would place on protecting their child from the fire of this dunya. So if you imagine a mother and a father and their child is running towards a pit of fire, how are they going to react? They're going to run, they're going to shout, they're going to scream, they're going to do everything within their capacity to stop their child from running into that pit of fire, from running into danger. Even if it means, for many parents, throwing themselves into the fire in place of their child. So he's saying, that's the emphasis that the teacher should place upon protecting the student from the fire of the next life. And this also means, and this is a problem that we have today, because many students, they're not willing to put themselves in this position with their teacher. It means that if the teacher says to the student, you're not ready for that yet, the student says, okay, I'm going to obey, I'm going to listen to you because you know better. If the student starts to give public talks, public khutbahs, starts to give online lectures, and his or her teacher says, you're not ready for that, then the student says, ultimately, you know better than me. Why? Because the teacher has the best intentions in heart for the student. The teacher doesn't want the student to ruin him or herself by the corruption of the camera, fame, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately today, we don't put ourselves in that situation with our teachers. We're not willing to allow the teacher to tell us what to do and what not to do. It also means sometimes the teacher will tell the student, you're not ready to study the science yet, focus on something more basic. But again, we're not willing to put ourselves in that situation. And the one that does put themselves into that position with their teacher, if their teacher is qualified, they'll learn a lot more than the one who doesn't listen. And he says, for this reason, وَلِذَلِكَ صَارَ حَقِّ الْمُعَلِّمِ أَعْظَمْ مِنْ حَقِّ الْوَالِدَيْنِ. For this reason, the right of the teacher over the student is more than the right of the parents over the child. Why? Because the parents ultimately take care of the dunya of this person, and the teacher or the teachers take care of the person's akhirah. Then he says, الوظيفة الثانية أن يقتدي بصاحب الشرع فلا يطلب على إفادة المعلم أجرا ولا يقصد به جزاء ولا شكرا بل يعلم فلا يطلب على إفادة العلم أجرا ولا يقصد به جزاء ولا شكرا بل يعلم لوجه الله تعالى وطلبا للتقرب إليه ولا يرى لنفسه من عليهم بل يرى الفضل لهم إذ هذبوا قلوبهم لأن تتقرب إلى الله تعالى بزراعة العلوم فيها. So he's saying that the person who's teaching should follow in the way of صاحب الشرع. The صاحب الشرع here meaning the Prophet ﷺ. The teacher should try to follow in the way of the Prophet ﷺ. How so? He says, for example, he should not seek through that which is benefiting the people, i.e. the knowledge, reward. He shouldn't openly seek financial remuneration for that which he's teaching. In a situation where he's able to live without some sort of financial stipend or some sort. The issue of, for example, the teacher receiving a financial stipend payment, the mu'adhin, the musalli, the teacher, this issue has been discussed by the fuqaha and it's permissible. But previously the teachers would be given a stipend by the government, the state, etc., which should suffice them. But if the teacher is using the status that he has over his students to take money from them, that's where the problem lies. Not that they're paying for a course or something like that, no. Sometimes that's necessary. But it's where he or she is utilizing the favor that he or she has over the students to take money from them. It's misuse of power, basically, for financial gains. Likewise, when the teacher teaches, they should not be seeking reward or in statement, as in praise. They shouldn't be teaching to receive praise. If the student never says thank you to the teacher for what the teacher has taught the student, that's a problem, definitely, and the student is at fault there. But the teacher should not feel moved by this, ultimately, because their intention should be for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. They shouldn't be expecting a thank you. And most of the time, people don't really say thank you for things that they get given by other people. Because as humans, we take things for granted. That's the unfortunate case. But the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Man lam yashkur al-nas, lam yashkur Allah." Whoever does not thank the people does not thank Allah. And there are different interpretations to this. One of the interpretations to this is that the one who doesn't thank the people, it's not in his nature to be thankful. Therefore, it's very likely that he's not going to be thankful to Allah either. Why? Because his nature is an ungrateful nature. Others, they say that to thank Allah, you have to thank the people. To show your gratitude to Allah, a part of that process is by showing your gratitude to the people whom Allah has utilized to grant you with the benefit that you're showing gratitude for. He says, بَلْ يُعَلِّمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. He should be teaching for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And as a means of taqarrub, seeking closeness to Allah. And if you think about the station that the teacher can potentially acquire, it's an amazing place. Why? The teacher who teaches people how to pray, the teacher who teaches people how to recite the Quran, the teacher who teaches people how to practice any element of Islam, they are going to have the reward of those who follow that practice that they have taken from the teacher. Likewise, the generations that may learn from that person. If a young man attends a class and learns something and then teaches his children one day, who's going to get a part of the reward? The teacher that taught him. So being a teacher of the sciences of Islam, there's an opportunity for closeness to Allah that can't be attained in anything else. The one who teaches for the sake of Allah, and they're qualified to teach, is better than the one who stands in prayer all day. Why? Because the one who stands in prayer all day is benefiting himself. But the one who teaches is benefiting the entire society. And to teach, you have to learn to deal with different types of people. You have to learn to deal with different character types. You have to learn to be patient, and you have to learn to be compassionate, and so on and so forth. So to be a teacher, it's a great honor, and it's something, unfortunately today, many of our young brothers and sisters, they don't say to themselves, I would like to be a teacher of the sciences of Islam. It's not something that comes to mind. I would like to be a teacher who teaches Islam to people. Why? Because there isn't really a great financial gain to be made. Normally today, in our time anyway, maybe I've heard it's different in America, I don't know. But usually anyway, there isn't a great amount of money to be made through teaching, like there is in other careers. And so young people today don't think about it. But if you think about what you can potentially acquire in the akhirah, it's worth more than what you can acquire in this life. And the other issue we have is the reality of society. At the end of the day, whether you're a teacher or you're a student, whatever it is that you are, you have to pay the bills. And in order to pay the bills, you have to make money. And that's why we should also take into consideration as a community, and I say this not just for Lewisham, but beyond Lewisham, that we should think about having institutions that pay well for our teachers. Why? Because if we want quality education for our children, we have to have quality delivery. And if you want quality delivery, you have to have long-term teachers. The current process is we don't offer a good wage to our teachers. Sometimes it's because the institutions don't have the financial ability. You have parents that don't even want to pay for the education of their children, etc. But what happens is when you don't offer good wages, you're going to get short-term staff. You're going to have teachers that are there for temporary positions. But if you're paying competitive prices for teaching, then you're going to have teachers that are going to invest their time into the position. Why? Because they can see this as a stable position to take up for years to come. And that's what we want ultimately for our communities. We want quality delivery, therefore we have to put in the money. That's the reality of the matter. Just as when we go to university, we pay fees. Why? Because we value the certificate. We should also value the education that we receive here. Even though there's no real certificate to take away from the education that a person may receive here, i.e. within the Islamic sciences, it's in the akhirah that our children are going to benefit. When we look at what's happening now within our communities, one of the biggest problems we have is a lack of education. The biggest problem that we have really is a lack of education. Whether it's a cultural practice of Islam, a cultural monopolization of Islam, basic problems that we deal with, such as racism. Sometimes you could even suggest there's an element of nationalism, tribalism, problems with gender roles, problems within marriages. Most of it comes down to a lack of education. If we were to be educated in the manners of being a man, if our women were educated in the manners of being women, if our young people were educated in the mannerisms of being young, the mannerisms of being old, if we were to learn about what race means within Islam, it's insignificant, and things like this, then our mindsets would change, the way that we see the world would change. But it requires good teachers that are able to teach according to the context, and they have the qualification behind them, and so on and so forth. It's something to think about. We're very willing to put a lot of money into the buildings, but the people that make up those buildings, we don't invest into them, and it's a big problem, and it's going to get bigger. Then he says, al-wadhifatu al-thalitha ألا يدع من نصح المتعلم شيئا, so that he basically doesn't hold back from advising his student, the teacher. And this is very important, and this is something which should not only be between a teacher and a student, but between a friend and a friend, a brother and a brother, a sister and a sister. And we have become, as a people generally speaking today, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, overly sensitive. We become too sensitive, where we're very easily offended, and we're very quick to become judgmental and defensive. The best friend, the best companion you will ever have is a companion or a friend that is not afraid to advise you when you're doing something wrong. But today, unfortunately, for many of us, we don't want friends that are honest and that advise. We want yes men, people that would tell us what we're doing is good and right, and they will justify what we're doing regardless of what we're doing. And that is a problem. That will lead you into big holes and big problems in life. We need people that will tell us, you're wrong, fear Allah. That's what we need. The best friend that you can ever find is a friend who will tell you when you're doing something wrong, you're doing something wrong. When you pick up the phone and complain to him about life, he'll tell you, fear Allah. This is qadar. Pull up your socks. That's something that we need. We need friends that are honest with us, that remind us of our purpose here, and they're able to be sometimes stern with us. And we need to develop the ability to receive nasiha. A teacher of mine, he said something very important. He said, if someone comes to advise you, even if you disagree with the advice, thank them for giving you that advice. Why? Because number one, it shows they care about you. And number two, it encourages them to continue to advise people. And that's something that we need within our communities, people that are willing to advise. Sometimes people might not advise in the best of ways, but that's something we can overlook. We have to learn to overlook. We should not negate something because we don't like the way that it was said. No, we have to have the maturity to accept the truth regardless how it was said and who said it. And then we can advise them in changing their manner of advising. You know, we could say, Jazakallahu khairan for the advice, but I advise you next time when you advise, try to be a bit softer. You know, it's nasiha. Likewise within a marriage, husband and wife, developing the ability to be able to advise each other. But of course, it needs to be done in the right way, because the way that a man would advise another man is not the way that a man should advise his wife. And likewise, the way that a woman would advise another woman is not the way she should advise her husband. It's about learning the language which is suitable for the context. And that's a problem that we have, a lack of communication skills, and that goes back to education. If we study the Prophet ﷺ, his ability to communicate with different people, different ages, different groups, within different contexts, something that we could learn so much from. Communication is what distinguishes us from the beasts. The ability to speak, the ability to learn, the ability to communicate. And so using that and learning how to communicate is very important. And if we were to open our eyes a little bit and take note of our surroundings, it will become very clear that there are some people, they know what to say, but they don't know how to say it. And so they very often get shut down. For example, some young people, when they speak to their elders, what they're saying might be correct, but the way they're saying it is the problem. And that's upon them. But likewise, the elders have to have the maturity to be able to accept what is being said, regardless of how it's being said. And that takes a lot of emotional maturity. Then he says, الوظيفة الرابعة وهي من دقائق صناعة التعليم أي يزجر المتعلم عن سوء الأخلاق بطريق التعريض ما أمكن ولا يصرح وبطريق الرحمة ولا بطريق التوبيخ. And this is something which is, again, it's a lost kind of art, you could say, which is basically he's saying that the teacher should warn the student and should advise the student and should be able to tell the student off without being direct and without shaming the student. Why? Because when you shame a student, you're taking away from the student's dignity, and being harsh is never appropriate when it comes to advising, when it comes to teaching. Harshness is not appropriate, especially public harshness. Perhaps, and of course there's a rule, that to every rule there are exemptions. So there may be certain situations, exemptions where, yeah, a little bit of harshness is required. But public harshness, where it's shame, name and shame, this is not going to cause a person to change. In fact, it may push the person away. And the Prophet ﷺ, he would never publicly name and shame someone. He would always say, مَا بَالَ أَقْوَامٍ مَا بَالَ قَوْمٍ. He would say, what is it that certain people? Why is it that certain groups? He would generalize and get the message across. And of course, if you are the person who has made the mistake, and the mistake is being generalized, spoken about generally, you're going to understand. The Prophet ﷺ was speaking about me there. So likewise, following in that manner. And it's the skill of communication. And the reality is, perhaps maybe 70 to 80% of good teaching is the ability to communicate, the ability to articulate concepts, to help students to visualize, to make things clear, to understand the context, to understand the thinking, to understand the manner which is appropriate, and so on and so forth. That's the art of teaching. And it's something which we require in this time. There are many, if they were to go to certain masajid, certain institutes, they would be put off Islam by the way that Islam is being taught. And when you teach something, it's not just about the way you speak, it's about the way you present yourself. It's about the language that you use. It's about the tone. There are so many elements to teaching, which if we were to look into and to study, we would be greatly benefited as a community. And it's not an exaggeration to say that people are put off the deen by the lack of ability to teach for certain teachers, and a lack of understanding. If for example a person were to apply the way that Islam is taught in Saudi Arabia here, you would put people off the deen, because it's a different culture, it's a different mindset, there are different needs, there are different understandings. Even when you use a certain word, the visualization of that word is going to be different from context to context. Jokes, you may say a joke here, everyone laughs. You say a joke in another country and you ruin people's lives because of the lack of context. So it's very important. Communication, again, it's what distinguishes us from beast. And so we should put a lot of attention into our approach in communication, the way we communicate. If you look online, for example, the way that certain teachers present Islam, you would assume that Islam is only for a certain ethnic group because of the language that they're using, the way that they're speaking, the clothing that they're wearing. And that shouldn't be the case. Islam, a person should look at Islam and say, this is a religion for everyone. And that language, clothing, mannerism of teaching, etc. And then he says, الوظيفة الخامسة أن المتكفل ببعض العلوم ينبغي أن لا يقبح في نفس المتعلم العلوم التي وراءه. He says كمعلم اللغة إذ من عادته تقبيح علم الفقه ومعلم الفقه عادته تقبيح علم الحديث بل ينبغي للمتكفل بعلم واحد أن يوسع على المتعلم طريق التعلم في غيره. And this again is a very important point, and sometimes it does happen, and you can see it online. He says that the person who has taken responsibility for one particular science should not make other sciences seem irrelevant to the student. He says sometimes you'll find that the teacher of language will belittle the science of fiqh, and the teacher of fiqh will belittle the science of hadith. And those that have studied some fiqh with me might say that I do that sometimes. And the teacher of hadith might belittle the sciences of Quran and so on and so forth. He says, but rather what the teacher should do is basically open the student's mind and heart to all of the sciences of Islam. Try to encourage the student to have a well-rounded understanding of all of the sciences. But that's not to say that certain sciences are not more relevant than others. There are definitely certain sciences that are more relevant than others. Here he says the teacher of fiqh will often belittle the science of hadith, but I would suggest in this time today, the science of fiqh is more important than the science of hadith. Why? Because hadith has been documented, it's been compiled, we know where we go to get it from. We still need those who understand the science of hadith to go to the books and understand what the ulama have said. But fiqh today is more relevant. Why? Because we have new issues that are constantly emerging, and we need to develop solutions for those problems based upon the framework of the Quran and the Sunnah, and that's what the science of fiqh is. And in order to be a scholar of fiqh or a student of fiqh with a proficient understanding, enough so that you can help to contribute with solutions, you have to have an understanding of the science of hadith anyway. Likewise, the science of the Quran. But the point is, a person should never see that which he is teaching as better than that which others are teaching. Rather, he should see himself as a part of a team. If I'm teaching fiqh and someone else is teaching hadith, we're working towards the same goal. And if a person who specializes in one science feels, grief because a student of his or hers is now moving on to another science, then perhaps they need to look at their intention. What really is their intention behind teaching? Because perhaps they're not actually calling to Islam, they're calling to the self. And especially amongst teachers generally. If someone is teaching, let's say in Lewisham, and he hears that his or her previous student has now gone to another institute down the road, and he feels grief because of that, saddened by that, maybe even some jealousy, some anger because of that, then he needs to check his intention. It could be a problem with the intention, and the intention is subtle, and if the intention is not correct, then teaching is worth nothing. In fact, it leads a person to what? To Jahannam. So the intention is important. He says, al-wadhifatu sadisa, and just in saying that, it doesn't mean that a person should stop doing that which they're doing, which is of righteous action. No, it means that they should constantly be working on their intention whilst they're traveling the path of whatever it is that they're doing. He says, الوظيفة السادسة أن يقتصر بالمتعلم على قدر فهمه فلا يلقي إليه ما لا يبلغه عقله فينفره. قال ابن مسعود ما أنت بمحدث قوما حديثا لا تبلغه عقولهم إلا كان لبعضهم فتنة. And this is a great wisdom, and a wisdom that is often lost upon many, especially if you go online onto YouTube, and it's something that we've discussed previously. He says that the teacher should suffice the student with that which the student is able to understand and comprehend. And that, of course, is going to be based on, number one, their level of study so far, and number two, their capacity to understand. Because whether or not we like it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us all different abilities when it comes to intelligence. There are some who are highly intelligent, and there are others who are not so intelligent, and there are others who are average. And sometimes being highly intelligent is more problematic than being not too intelligent, because the overly intelligent, they can often harm themselves with their intelligence, especially if they are inquisitive and they don't have a source to go to kind of feed their inquisitiveness, and if they don't know when to stop. You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set boundaries for us, and examples can be given, but now is not the time. But then he mentions Ibn Mas'ud. He said, when speaking to some of the tabi'een, I assume, or perhaps some of the Sahaba, he said that you are not going to speak to a people and inform them of something which they are not intellectually ready for, except that it becomes a fitna for some of them. How so? If now, when speaking to a multitude of people who come from different backgrounds, especially in a masjid, you have those who are highly educated, those who are not so educated. When I say educated, I mean institutionally. Those who have critical thinking skills, those who do not have critical thinking skills. You have those who think in a black and white methodology, those who don't think in such a manner. You have those that behind every question they have another question, and you have those that take things at face value. If you start to talk about intricate matters of theology in such a crowd, you are going to potentially cause a fitna. Why? Because there is potentially a question behind every question. There is a statement that is not being said with every statement that is being said, and there is a statement that is implicitly being said with every statement that you are explicitly saying. And so for some, they walk away from the lecture and they've taken something which they assume to be beneficial. For others, you've left them with problems in their deen now, in their aqidah. When you talk about intricate issues that relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that were confined, they were previously only found in the books of the ulama and the students of the ulama. They weren't public issues. They weren't issues that were discussed publicly previously. When you take those issues and you translate them into another language, and you then present those issues to the masses in a language which was not the original language, which means meanings can be misconstrued. Why? If I say, for example, a simple example, if I say milk in the English language, you're going to think of something. You're going to think of, perhaps it might be milk in a mug, it might be milk in a glass, it might be milk it might be a milk carton or bottle. But if you go to a people who take their milk directly from an animal and you say milk, the meaning changes. the context changes. And so when you're translating, you're going to be translating into a context. When you use one language, you are using the language within a context. And so there is meaning that is lost in the translation. When you speak to a person who comes from a nomadic region, his visualization of your words is going to be different to the visualization of a person who lives in a city. And you don't take that into context or into consideration, when you're speaking to a massive crowd. People understand things based upon their experiences. That's the way we work, individual experience or collective experience. And so when you are using words that relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're entering into dangerous territory. When you're doing it on a public setting anyway. When it's a teacher and a student, it's different. Why? Because the teacher gets to know the student. The teacher learns what the student is able to understand and what the student is not able to understand. But when speaking publicly, you are speaking to the literate and the illiterate. And so now imagine now on YouTube, when a person thinks they're being smart and clever by talking about intricate theological issues on a public platform like YouTube that is readily available to those who are highly intelligent and those who are really not intelligent, to those who live in a city and those who live in nomadic regions. You're potentially going to have a real negative impact on people's deen, people's belief. You're going to leave certain people with more questions than you're going to lead them to answers. And so knowing who you're speaking to, knowing their ability to understand is very important. The ulama of the past, in fact, would not teach people that they did not deem to be smart enough to learn. And that might sound like discrimination. But if you want to become a doctor, there is an entry exam. Not anyone can become a doctor. You have to pass the entry exam. If you don't pass the entry exam to become a doctor, you can apply to be a pharmacist. Is that not discrimination? Certain types of discrimination are necessary. That's the reality of the matter. I don't want someone operating on me if they're not intelligent enough to understand how to operate. Likewise, in the deen, we do not want people to talk about the deen if they're not intelligent enough to talk about the deen. That was the approach of the ulama of the past. Likewise, you don't want, if you're leading an army, you don't want individuals that don't know how to fight in your army. You want individuals that have the capacity and have the education and they know what they're doing. So sometimes you have to discriminate. And here is a place where we have to discriminate. If you're not smart enough to learn something, then you can't learn it, unfortunately. And we live in a time, like I said earlier, we become too sensitive. Not everyone is going to be suitable for learning, just as not everyone is going to be suitable for fighting. Not everyone is going to be suitable to be a doctor. If my hands are shaking all the time, I can't operate, unfortunately. That's how it works. You know, if my hands shake all the time, I'm not going to be painting certain parts of the wall. I'm going to leave it to someone else. Likewise in the deen, if I'm not intelligent enough to understand, then it's not for me. Certain aspects. And that's the role of the teacher. The teacher has to understand who's intelligent enough to understand something and who's not intelligent enough. And who is too intelligent. Because if someone is too intelligent, there are certain things that this person should not learn until they reach an age of maturity. Why? Because the maturity balances out their intelligence. The maturity keeps them from going beyond the boundary. But when a person is not mature and highly intelligent, it can sometimes lead them and others into destruction. And if you look at most of the heads of the historical groups of innovation, I'm talking about real innovation, not the innovation that people accuse people of being a part of today, but real innovation. For example, the Mu'tazila and so on and so forth. Those who founded those groups, the heads of those groups, were highly intelligent individuals. Highly intelligent. Being too intelligent sometimes is a problem, unless you have someone that helps you to balance that intelligence out. And that's why the teacher is so important. And then he says, and we'll end with this one inshallah, as it's the last one, الوظيفة السابعة أن يكون المعلم عاملا بعلمه فلا يكذب قوله فعله. He says that, and this is perhaps the most important one, he says that the teacher should be one who acts upon his knowledge. Why? His statements should not be deemed to be lies by his actions. If you're calling people to salah and you're not praying, then you are a hypocrite. He says, al-Ghazali, he quotes the ayah from Surah Al-Baqarah, أَتَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسَ بِالْبِرِّ وَتَنْسَوْنَ أَنفُسَكُمْ. And this, of course, was a verse which was directed towards the children of Israel, the tribes of the Jewish tribes of Medina at the time, as they were claiming to be righteous and talking about righteousness, but they weren't acting upon it themselves. But it's a verse which is applicable to us and to all people. Are you calling people to that which is good, but you yourself are not doing it? And this is an important discussion. Ibn Kathir, he talks about it in his tafsir. Can a person call others to that which he is not doing, or prevent others from that which he himself is doing? Let's say, for example, a person is afflicted with the calamity, may Allah protect us, of watching things that they shouldn't be watching on their screens, their laptops, their TVs, whatever it might be. Can they publicly tell people not to do it? If it's something that they're trying to leave off, but they keep slipping up, then yes, they should. They should, because if we say that it's a condition that you're not sinning in order to call people to good and prevent evil, then no one will ever be able to call to good and prevent from evil, as we're all sinners. But the difference is, if you're purposefully doing something that you're telling others not to do. You're telling people not to smoke in the daytime, and you're going home and you're lighting up cigarettes with no remorse. That's where the problem lies. That's pure hypocrisy. But if you're slipping up, you have a history with smoking, for example, and you end up taking a few puffs of a cigarette, and then you put it out and you say astaghfirullah, and you turn back to Allah, you still have the right to warn others. In fact, you might even have more right. Why? Because you can tell people, I know what it's like, I know the problems of this, don't do it, don't make the mistake that I made. But if you go home and you're smoking and you're relaxing and you're enjoying it, then you're basically falling into a hypocrite and into hypocrisy. And the Prophet ﷺ said there will be a people or a person in Jahannam whose insides will be they'll be walking around their insides, just as a mule or a horse or something walks around the post that it's tied to, and the people will come and say, you used to call us to good and prevent us from evil, why are you here? And he will say, I used to call you to that which I didn't do, and I used to prevent you from that which I did. And that's one of the dangers of being a person who speaks about Islam publicly. You're calling people to ikhlas, but yet you're calling people to you by calling people to ikhlas. You're calling people, you're saying, look at me, I want to be famous, I want to be on the camera. But you're calling people to be sincere, to have ikhlas. So it's a dangerous place. Some of the Sahaba, they used to run away from talking, from answering questions and things like this, because of the danger that it entails. But we take it for granted. We take it lightly. You go online nowadays, and subhanAllah, everyone's a qualified mufti on Twitter and YouTube and things like this. But they don't realize that their words are going to be taken into account. The Prophet ﷺ, what did he say? That the mujtahid, he has two rewards. The mujtahid, being the one who's qualified to give a ruling, has two rewards. If he was wrong, he has the reward of his ijtihad. If he was right, he has the reward of his ijtihad and the reward of being correct. But the ulama say from this hadith, also, the one who is not qualified to speak, if they speak, they're sinning, regardless whether they were correct or incorrect. Why? Because they're not qualified to speak in the first place. And the worst science to speak about, people assume the worst thing you can do is give a fatwa. No, the worst thing to speak about without knowledge is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what most people are doing today when they have debates about aqeedah. When they're debating about aqeedah, those people really, they're not qualified. And if you listen to their arguments, they really don't understand the arguments of the people that they're opposing. And secondly, after that, is to speak about other people. This person's an innovator, and that person's misguided, and this person's that, and that person's this, and so on and so forth. And even worse than that, that person's a kafir, that person's left Islam, that person's a murtad, that person's a munafiq. The worst thing a person can possibly do. Why? Because now you're speaking about something that only Allah knows, which is the heart. So the best thing to do is to take the advice of the Prophet ﷺ, مَنْ كَانَ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لَيَصْمُتْ. Whoever believes in Allah and the last day, let him say that which is good or keep quiet. The best thing to do is to keep quiet. If someone asks, say, I don't know. I believe they say they attribute it to Isa alayhi salam. He said that لا أدري نصف العلم. Allahu a'lam if he actually said it, but they say that Isa alayhi salam said, to say I don't know is half of knowledge. And we spoke about it previously. Why? Because if you say I don't know, most questions you're not going to know the answer to anyway, so you've learned the answer to most questions. So you just say لا أدري, I don't know, and then you've got the answer. And that applies to the ulama. If the alim needs to learn how to say I don't know, what about lay people? Lay people, that should be their default go-to answer. Someone asks something about Islam, I don't know. Is there a time where the lay person should answer? Yes, if they have information which is relevant to a person at the time and there's no one else that can possibly suffice the person. So for example, teaching a new Muslim how to pray, teaching a person who doesn't know the alif, ba, ta, how to read, etc. Yeah, that's something else. But knowing the limits, and knowing our limits is very difficult. It's easy to say la adri until you're in the spotlight. When you're in the spotlight saying I don't know, that's when it becomes difficult. And so the best thing to do perhaps is not to put ourselves in the spotlight. We'll end with that inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad. If there are any questions, then yeah.